All right, let's talk about how we look at art today. Two people can look at the same situation or view the same work of art and walk away with completely different understandings. Our knowledge, our experience, and our visual vocabularies precede our interaction with any work of art. I'm always going to see something from within my circumstances, and you're always going to see something from within yours. I, for example, have spent a lot of time studying Northern Renaissance art. When I look at any artwork from any period, I rely on a set of skills and visual habits that I learned from looking at that type of art. And one of the most rewarding parts of studying art for me is the ability to recognize the limitations of my visual habits and finding other people with different skills and different habits. I study art because I like the conversations about art. I like to study the art world because it helps me build connections and relationships in the real world. A work of art serves as a site of exchange, a place to learn and be challenged. So when I sat down to start researching Lorna Simpson, an artist that I've wanted to study for a long time, I was struck when one of the first images I saw was this. It activated a whole bunch of stuff in my brain and my visual memory, but I also knew it would introduce me to a host of other experiences. In the best cases, an image will make me question the way that I see. It'll dislodge me from my comfortable subjective position, and that's exactly what this image does. So this image is called The Waterbearer by Lorna Simpson. It includes both a photograph and some text just below it. I was drawn in first by the image and then knocked off balance by the text, so that will serve as the organizing structure of this video. So for me, the photograph immediately reminded me of a host of different images from the history of art. The three first images that came to mind were The Milkmaid by Vermeer, The Source by Ingres, and The Danaids by Waterhouse. This image doesn't exist outside of context. It exists within the history of art and therefore pulls in meaning from that history. So with my specific background knowledge, I start interpreting the image based on those allusions. The Milkmaid, for example, is a genre painting that features everyday life. One thing that annoying Renaissance historians like me will always point out is that this milkmaid wears a blue apron. And the reason that we always point this out is because that color had previously been reserved for the Virgin Mary in paintings. Blue was an expensive pigment during the 15th and 16th century, and so it was reserved for the most important characters in a painting. The Virgin Mary, if she appears, is very likely to be the most important person in the painting. So blue becomes associated with the Mother of God. If you're trained in Renaissance traditions of art like I am, blue activates a certain response. So when I see this Vermeer, I see the milkmaid as merging the secular and the sacred. Vermeer is telling us that she's important in the same way that saints are important. And so now I've got this painting, The Milkmaid, and this conversation about that painting bouncing around in my head right away when I look at The Waterbearer. But layered on top of that, this image also evokes The Source by Ingres, and this painting links this pale female body with nature by hinting that this woman is the source of a river or something. In that way, the female body becomes positively associated with the purity of a freshwater spring. Beauty, nature, and purity are all mixed together in this image in a way that links beauty and purity. And if you know anything about the history of art and the female body being associated with purity, then you know that this brings with it a lot of associations of sexual purity and virginity. Another common way to interpret the source is that she, and the water that she pours out, are the source of artistic inspiration. Any way that you interpret this image, though, this is a woman under the gaze, and it's our role as the viewer to project meaning onto her, and in doing so, we dehumanize her as a symbol of something else, as a starting place for life and nature itself, or the vehicle to be used as a path toward artistic production. So now I've got this painting, and this conversation about this painting, bouncing around in my head as I look at The Waterbearer. But layered on top of that, this image also evokes The Danaids by Waterhouse. And this painting illustrates the Greek myth of 50 daughters who were pressured into marrying 50 sons, who happened to be their cousins, and on the night of their marriage, murder those husbands. Their punishment in the underworld is to constantly fill a bath that has a hole in it. So their story represents something similar to the myth of Sisyphus. They're constantly engaged in an impossible, never-ending struggle to complete something that can't be completed. So now I've got this painting, and the conversations about this painting bouncing around in my head as I look at The Waterbearer. I see this as a place somewhere between the secular and the sacred, like the milkmaid. At the same time, I become aware about how my gaze is seeking to impose patriarchal purity standards and dehumanize the subject of the photograph through allegorical readings, as is what I see when I see the source. And finally, I see her task, whatever it might be, as futile in the same way that I see the Danaids filling that bath. Now, you might have other associations or other works of art that this reminds you of, but those are mine, and with that, I have enough to think about. The sanctity of the human experience, constantly fighting, endlessly and unsuccessfully, the powerful subordinating gaze of others who seek to conform the female subject to certain roles and expectations. I mean, that's heavy. That gives us something to reflect upon. But then there are the ways that this image clearly deviates from those historical images, and all these deviations add more layers. Her back is turned to us, resisting our gaze. She's black when the others are white. She pours the water in two distinct directions when the others only have a single focus. So yeah, this image has given me a lot to think about, and that's just using the furniture that I have in my own head. And that's cool. But then I started reading about the subjective experiences of others, and that's where the magic happens. And yeah, nearly everybody also mentions Vermeer and Ingres. I'm not bringing anything unique to this conversation. But the first essay in the first book that I read for this video called my attention to the two different containers, one metal one and one plastic. If we read the image from left to right, we might see that as a move from past to present. If we focus on the materials, we might read it as a difference distinguishing social class, the metal signifying wealth while the plastic signifies poverty. So the composition of the image asks us to compare the two containers, which could represent history or social class or something I'm not realizing yet. And from those containers, this woman pours a steady stream of water. And I don't know if there's a more loaded symbol in the history of human image making than water. It represents knowledge. It represents a blessing. It's life-giving. It's purity and purifying. So when we have two distinct containers pouring out the same clear liquid, that means something. It implies that outside of past and present, outside of how fancy we package it, the water remains constant. The water, and everything it means, does not change depending on the context. So if we add this layer of meaning onto the meanings I began with, we have a photograph that explores the sanctity of the human experience, constantly fighting, endlessly and unsuccessfully, the powerful subordinating gaze of others who seek to conform the female subject to certain roles and expectations. And she carries with her the blessings of the past and present, the pure, life-giving knowledge represented by the water which appears unchanged regardless of how it's carried. This photograph just gets deeper and deeper the more perspectives we get. So now we can turn our gaze to the text below the image. So the text below the photograph says, "She saw him disappear by the river. They asked her to tell what happened only to discount her memory." Before we start discussing how this text changes the tone of the artwork as a whole and how it might interact with the image, let's just take the text on its own. It starts by giving the female subject the authority of experience. She saw him disappear by the river. When asked for her testimony, though, when asked to share her experience, the population referred to only as they discount her memory. With that, this work of art explores the experience of female and minority communities, and how majority populations and institutions can overlook or ignore the truth of their experience. And in a larger sense, it's representative of the way that any subjective experience of any kind is always subordinate to the hegemonic narrative of power and history. To say that with less jargon, all of us are forced to conform our experience to the expectations of our society or community, and those expectations are produced by power hierarchies and passed down through history. This is true at an individual level, like we experience the oppression of those expectations as individuals, but it's also true at the population level. When we learn history, that history is always edited. It has to be. We can't learn the entire past. And so we grow up learning a version of history and assume that that's the way that history is supposed to look. There are certain paradigms or models that we take for granted. If your education was anything like mine, then it was mostly Western history, mostly about wars, and mostly featured men. So we assume that that's what history is supposed to look like. That's what the past looks like. And because memory and historical knowledge are always subjugated to the dominant paradigms of history, any information or experience that doesn't fit into those narratives is dismissed or ignored. If it's not Western, if it's not about great men doing great things, then it doesn't make the history books. She could see him by the river, but her experience won't make the final edit. For example, in his book Silencing the Past, Michel-Rolph Trouillot discusses the Haitian Revolution and why it's so often ignored in history classes and popular culture. He argues that a successful slave rebellion did not fit neatly into pre-existing narratives and racial ideologies, and that, even at the time that it was happening, the French did not have a framework for conceptualizing the rebellion. If the French Revolution was about liberté, égalité, and fraternité, then how does a slave colony rebelling against that government fit in? It's probably best if we just leave that out of the history books, for the sake of the narrative. Trouillot asks, if some events cannot be accepted even as they occur, how can they be assessed later? In other words, can historical narratives convey plots that are unthinkable in the world within which these narratives take place? How does one write a history of the impossible? Trying to answer these questions reveal how systems of power control the production of historical knowledge and can dismiss evidence and experience if it doesn't align with the dominant narrative. The Haitian Revolution happened, but it doesn't fit well into the story of Europe's march towards democratic liberty, so we leave it out of the historical narrative. Again, she saw him disappear by the river, but they discount her memory. It happened. She saw it. But we ignore it, and they discount it. So turning back to the specific language used in the text, I'm not quite sure what to make of that symbolic river, but the river certainly evokes for me those jugs of water and the allusion to the source. Perhaps her knowledge is the water of unadulterated truth which she pours out for us, though we can't see where it goes. These sorts of questions bring us back to the image and the way that this text helps complicate the meaning of this work even further. In one way, the text destabilizes the peaceful tone established by the image, but in another way, it confirms some of the assumptions I made by examining the art historical references. This photograph does, similar to Vermeer's Milkmaid, assert the sanctity of experience, even as it is dismissed by those who discount it. The photograph uses the water as a symbol of pure knowledge, with the woman as its source. And the photograph represents the unending and frustrating task of asserting one's subjective experience within a system of power designed to discredit it. Additionally, because the text focuses our attention on the idea of testimony, the central image now appears to me like Lady Justice, or perhaps more appropriately, the scales of justice, which seem tipped in favor of the metal jug. The jug that might signify money or the force of dominant historical narratives. And those thoughts, those ideas that are clicking into place as we continue to think about this image, they're frustrating. This endless dominance of power and history, we want her to be believed, but she isn't. Yet the image is peaceful, and its subject resists our gaze. She looks somewhere else for peace. In the best essay I've seen written on this work, Bell Hooks writes that the black woman in the photograph understands that memory has healing power. She is not undone, not in any way torn apart by those dominating gazes that refuse her recognition. Able to affirm the reality of her presence, of the absent him whose voice, unlike hers, might be listened to. She bears witness to the sound of the water and its meaning for her life. Here is a portrait of serenity, of being, of making peace with oppositional history. By pairing the image with the text, this work examines the underlying causes of oppression. It forces us to consider the power of our own gaze and the stories that we can't hear because our systems don't listen or document them, because we don't listen. And this challenge to documentation through photography might evoke other allusions from the history of art. It might make us think of those popular images like those done by Dorothea Lange and others that documented the Depression. In those black and white images from the 1930s, the photographer documents suffering in isolation from the larger forces that cause it. The people in those images suffer, but it's unclear why. It just documents their pain. Simpson's photograph, on the other hand, questions the ability of photography to document anything at all, because photography exists within larger systems of power. Her protagonist finds peace in knowing her truth, even if it will be discredited by us, the viewer. Kelly Jones explains this well in her essay Unseen and Overheard, Pictures by Lorna Simpson. She writes, embedded in the very structure of the work itself, in this case, in the confrontation between the specificity of individual vision and the need of social forces to control what is recorded, is the action of the artist prying into the history of photographic practice, questioning what we see and how we see it. The photographic truth lies somewhere in the space between the image, the text and our response to it. And so it turns out that in some ways this work of art is about the process of looking at art and the ways that I want to experience art. The photographic truth lies somewhere between Simpson's image, the text, and our collective response to it. We each bring partial perspectives to any work of art, and when we discuss it, we get closer to understanding it and to understanding each other. So let's discuss it. Thank you for watching.